Right, the Prime Minister Rami Hamdallah sort of leading that initiative at the moment. Let's get more on this with Craig Snyder. He's the President and CEO of the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia. And Craig, Guterres saying that a two-state solution is the only solution. What do you make of that?
Well, I think that is still the majority view among people who look at the issue in the United States, in Europe, and I believe in Israel as well. It's the potential alternatives of permanent occupation on the one hand, or a one-state solution in which somehow the Palestinians become citizens of Israel have enormous problems. And so I think the two-state solution remains the one that people continue to hope for and to work for, including a majority of American Jews.
It was last week when the U.S. Middle East envoy Jared Kushner, President Trump's top advisor, and of course Jason Greenblatt, met with Palestinian leaders, Israeli leaders, and seemed to report, at least to administration officials, they felt there had been some progress. Now we see Guterres in the region. Do you read anything into any of this?
Not especially. You have to look at this in the long view, and there's a kind of a Groundhog Day quality, seeing the same day over and over again, with each new envoy. Remember Secretary John Kerry's efforts, very significant efforts in 2014, and you can go back probably every couple years for the last 70. There's been a lot of hope and a lot of talk and a lot of activity around diplomacy, but I don't see this as being particularly new. Secretary General Guterres is relatively new in his job, just since January. This is his first visit as Secretary General to the region, something he has to do, something that's appropriate for him to do, but I don't think it marks any kind of breakthrough.
Craig, Guterres vowed that he would approach Israel impartially. Now, the United Nations has been called out recently for its anti-Israel bias, particularly by the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, Nikki Haley. Do you sense any kind of change in approach by the UN?
Well, in terms of the coverage that I've seen of this trip by the Secretary General over the last couple of days, I think he's trying to say the right things. There's no question that the UN's role in the Middle East has been problematic from the Israeli point of view, but in some respects, in some respects from the Palestinian point of view as well, going back all the way to the 1948 decision by the United Nations to divide mandatory Palestine into a Jewish and an Arab state. So there's a long history that the Secretary would have to correct in order to really change things. But I do think, again, in terms of the coverage that I've seen, that he's made real efforts to be balanced, telling the Israelis things that they don't particularly want to hear, but also telling the Palestinian Authority things that they don't want to hear. For example, that the curtailing of electricity into Gaza is a humanitarian crisis, and that they need to renounce terrorism. And very importantly, in terms of the UN's history on this, saying affirmatively from the pulpit of the Secretary General of the UN that those who refuse to accept the right of Israel to exist are anti-Semites. That's a big change in terms of rhetoric coming out of the UN headquarters.
And it does seem as if Guterres has enjoyed his trip and seeing things that perhaps he hasn't seen before. Is there a benefit that at least at the top of the United Nations, there's now perhaps a more complex, nuanced understanding of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict than you might think based on some of the resolutions that constantly get introduced at the UN?
Yes, I think there is. I mean, the Secretary General can't control what goes on the floor of the General Assembly, which is largely a political theater and political rhetoric used for political theater. But it's important. He has an important position in world affairs, and it's important for him to have some personal experience with this. Now, when he was Prime Minister of Portugal, he hosted a meeting, secret at the time, between these senior Israeli officials and senior Palestinian officials. So he's had some significant exposure to these issues before in his life, but he's in a new job, and this was his first time on that job in the region.
All right, Craig, we appreciate your insight. Craig Snyder, President and CEO of the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
You're welcome.